As the Science Magazine video hopefully made clear, we have been on a path of exponential population growth over the last century, although these trends are likely to change as people around the world make different decisions about how large their families are and how long they expect to live. And in this section, I want to start by talking about population pressures and how they link to the causes of conflict that we've seen so far in this class, and to introduce them as a background for some of the topics we're going to be looking at in the remainder of this section of the class. So this is, I put this first because I think population pressures, population characteristics of states that have conflicts or avoided conflicts are interacting with a lot of the other building blocks we will see in this week, in this section, as well as in the first section. And it is that population factor is in pretty much every conflict quantitative model that I've seen before. Population and GDP are those cornerstones in our model of conflict. And so I want to start today talking about what population is, where it's come from, where it's going, and how countries' population characteristics can drive the incentives for conflict. Okay, so the Science Magazine video showed this graph for those of you who didn't see it, but I think it's also worth mentioning again. This definition of an exponential curve over the brief lifespan of 4 or 5 generations has really been unparalleled. That we now had 7.7 billion in 2019. We'll definitely hit 8 billion by the end of this decade, and 9 billion by the end of the first half of the 21st century. And population, the further you go on past that, the more uncertain our estimates are about the size of the population within countries and overall, because of the difficulty in accurately estimating what people's decisions are about their willingness to have children, people's movements across borders, etc. And so this just shows how far we've come and what this will look like in 50, 100 years. Time will tell. I won't be around for that. But in the beginning of this course, I showed population density graphs like this of Burundi, a case study we've seen repeatedly in this class. I think it's worth now showing them again, as in week 1, to kind of show the differences within countries of where populations are. You have population density along Lake Tanganyika that's over 1,000 people per square kilometer. Then you have other areas that are below 25 people per kilometer, even in a small and highly concentrated society like in Burundi. Rwanda, a case that we're going to see more about in the next video as well. You have those around Kigali and elsewhere, more people living, while you have lower population density, but still quite high, between 25 and 249 people in other parts of the country. Bangladesh is going to be a case we're going to be looking at too, is even higher in the levels of population density, with over 1,000 people per square kilometer over a wide swath of the country. And just, I mean, in the region, Asia as the most populated region as of now, you see the population density in different parts of China and in India and in Indonesia. And each one of these dots represents thousands of lives. Each one of these dots represents challenges for, as well as opportunities for governments to be able to, the responsibility for them to provide services for their citizens, as well as to reap the benefits of their citizens' success through taxation. As we've seen over the course of the semester, the governments have difficulty in providing for their own citizens if they don't have that governmental capacity to do so. And different peoples in different regions in within this map as well as in other parts of the world are more or less able to do so, given a lot of the other building blocks that we've seen so far: the history of democracy, economic growth, colonial heritage. There's been a bunch of other factors that help explain why people are in different parts of the world, how they've got there, and the opportunities that they and their governments have. And it's amazing to contrast this map with us here in Australia, in which we do have a population density that is dramatically different than any of the other countries in the region, in which you do have those population clusters in the capital cities, urbanization rate of over 85%. In those urban areas, which provide an opportunity as well as a challenge for the government within the country. Excuse me. Am I going to sneeze? No, I'm not going to sneeze. So there's a lot of variation between Australia and the rest of the world, and there's also clear variation within Australia where people choose to live and where they're able to provide for their children. I am here in Ngunnawal country in the Australian Capital Territory. We have the highest population density of any state or territory within Australia, as it probably wouldn't surprise any Australian citizens amongst us, with over 151 people per kilometer. The next is Victoria, and way down at the bottom is Northern Territory with less than one, and Western Australia with less than one person per square kilometer. But I think this kind of brings home, when we talk about population and a lot of the empirical models of conflict, and in the papers that we've read so far, usually if anyone talks about population at all, is just all things being equal, larger populated countries are more likely to have conflict because of the opportunity. There's just more people. You're more likely to have at least enough people to either be greedy enough to try to take over the state or part of the state, or to have grievances against the state, and the opportunity to be able to act if there's more of a population to swim within. And there's a lot of different ways of trying to understand population characteristics. I think for me, as I move along my life path in the population of a number of different countries, is that there really are quite dramatic differences in different countries in the challenges that they face and what the faces of people within those countries actually look like. And another way of looking at them, like in the Science magazine video, is population pyramids. This is a population pyramid for Uganda in 2020. And it really does look, if not like a pyramid, then a stupa, in which you have this wide, flat base of people that are incredibly young, below 20, but the population that is under 5 years old is the largest segment of the population. And you have men dropping off more quickly than women as you get older in the population pyramid towards the top. And this is similar of a lot of developing countries like Burundi, which I already touched on, that you have a large number of people coming up from above that are going to have needs and desires and potential demands of the state that could cause problems later on. They're also crucial in order to keep working and being in their prime working years to be able to pay the social benefits for people that are older or retired in that population pyramid. And I think you can look at a number of these different population pyramids to have a sense of the different challenges and opportunities different societies face. So you see a lot of the developing countries that have that wider base, and they narrow quite quickly towards the top. You have other countries like Venezuela, in which those groups are more squished towards the bottom. You have more even cohorts between the 0 to 4s as you do the 25 to 29-year-olds. You have a larger population of older people, like in the Venezuelan case study video from, I think it was last week, in which you had those hardcore Hugo Chavez supporters, as well as people more critical of the current government in Venezuela. Those people are often the older populations that have that historical connection to the politics of a previous era that had dramatic effect on where the countries were at that time. Connect that to Australia, you actually have those that more of a squeezing towards the bottom, larger number of people at the older age groups, and the decline in the number of younger groups could be a function of people making different decisions about their decisions to have children or skilled migration. There's a bunch of different factors, but by and large, you contrast that with Burundi, you're looking at a systematically different set of population challenges within the state and a smaller number of people that would fall into that youth bulge category, which we're going to look at later. And then you get older countries like Japan and Germany, other countries in Europe, like the video was talking about, how you have the number of people in the 70 to 74 age group dramatically higher than those young, and that creates a whole host of different challenges for governments to be able to take care of the older populations without the younger populations there to be able to fill the jobs and to pay their taxes. And some people are just lucky to have jobs in general. When we look at population characteristics and connecting to the next couple of sections in this class, it's important to understand the jobs that they have and the opportunity to have jobs. This is a graph of youth unemployment in the European Union as of earlier this year. You see a dramatic difference in unemployment rates in certain countries around the Mediterranean, Greece, Spain, and Italy, which have over a quarter of their youth unemployed. This is actually down quite dramatically from the aftermath of the global financial crisis in 2007 and 2008. But as an opportunity cost argument, or as a way to try to understand what the effects are going to be on people's life trajectories and their careers, if you have less than a 75% chance of having a job, what effect does that have on your decisions to have children, to be able to settle down, or your opportunity cost to engage in more risky behavior compared to countries down towards the bottom like Germany and the Netherlands that have much lower levels of unemployment. And there's a lot of different ways of looking at these statistics, but I think it's important to try to understand the similarities and differences across contexts. And in the European Union in general, you saw a decline in unemployment from 2004 until 2008, and then when the financial crisis really hit, that skyrocketed up to 25% in 2013, though of course it was clustered in certain countries with connections to protests and dissatisfaction in those countries that I mentioned earlier. But right now, until now, we've pretty much recovered from that spike in youth unemployment due to the pandemic. That you do see that spike from 2020 to 2021, the number of people who were unemployed as the economies in a lot of countries ground to a halt, even in developed countries. Spain, you can see in 2012, after basically at that peak of unemployment that I showed in that earlier graph, there is a drastic difference in the who's unemployed depending on their age group, that in the 16 to 19 year time frame you had a much higher unemployment rate than you did compared to those in middle age between 25 and 54. And that is in part because a lot of people in the older age groups had more experience, that if there were scarce jobs that would have been taken by teenagers, I had jobs pretty much since I was 15 and a half and was able to work because I wanted the money and I liked the autonomy, and it was part of the culture and the expectations where I came from. But those opportunities were there for me because of the need for the youth to undertake jobs that the older people within the country weren't willing to do. These rates can also vary in a number of different contexts. We see here in Australia that we had much higher unemployment in the 1980s, right when inflation was last. It was much worse than it is now, but when hyperinflation was a reality then, we're worried about that now. End of the Cold War also saw high unemployment, but that declined pretty drastically and has been lower up until the financial crisis and variation around then. But it's still quite low compared to other countries like Venezuela. Back in before the oil prices really hit their stride in 2005, 2006, when Hugo Chavez undertook those policies that we saw last week in the videos. Connected back to the worst in the European Union with Greece, you see dramatically different trends in different countries, and the ability for people to have jobs, to have those resources to make those other decisions about their lives is one of those kind of David Foster Wallace background conditions that I think are important to keep in mind. And it also connects into the scarcity arguments that we've seen so far, and that we'll, I guess, talk about now, those kind of NeoMathusians who see growing environmental scarcity. This is a famous quote from Malthus. The power of population is indefinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. And it really hasn't happened. I mean, I could see before the dawn of the Industrial Revolution and the end of the 18th century, after having those huge convulsions in the United States and in France, with populations that were quite unequal compared to the elites, rose up and took control, that there would be a concern that there wasn't going to be enough resources to keep people satisfied, that there weren't going to be enough resources for everyone to meet their needs. But of course, in the readings for this week and in the general debates about the role of technology and governments and private market-based capitalism in to be able to provide for needs, and kind of contrast this with a statement from Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen, the economist, that said that no famine has ever taken place in the history of the world in a functioning democracy, which I think is really interesting, right? Malthus talked about the rising scarcity that would lead to famines, and Sen's argument is that if you have a functioning government to be able to provide for their citizens in a democratic system, the accountability is there, that no government would abdicate that responsibility to the extent that there would be widespread famine. And I think there's evidence for that when he was making this argument back in the 1990s, and I think in large part it has taken hold, although the skeptic in me would talk about the importance of potential endogeneity there, that part of the definition of what a functioning democracy is the fact that there is no famine. So you have to worry to what extent these things are causally related or correlated in a way because of other factors, right? So in trying to think of those kind of causal diagrams, where does scarcity play into this? In this, tying this back to the Homer-Dixon reading from a couple of weeks ago, the sources of environmental scarcity all connect to population pressures. Decreasing in quality or quantity of renewable resources can come because of a larger population making unsustainable demands on the land in which they live. Just an article came out today in the Washington Post talking about water scarcity in California, where I'm from, which is really viscerally important to me and my family who still live in Northern California and in Southern California. Population growth also as a source of environmental scarcity. You can make an arrow between those top two. And unequal resource access, right? Connecting to the analogy of the pie back in week 2, that you have, or maybe it was last week, the distribution could be unequal. Some people might have a disproportionate amount of the resources, which could lead to scarcity. And we're going to keep coming back to this. So how can population dynamics directly and indirectly affect resource scarcity and conflict? Connecting to the readings from this week, low population density can encourage relative resource abundance, which can have a mixed effects on conflict. If there's abundance, then everyone could have enough that there aren't the motivations to go to conflict. However, it could also be an incentive for other people to try to seize more control when there's relative abundance. There's more to gain if you try to take over a particular territory or group of people. High resource abundance can lead to relative resource scarcity if one part of the population has more than other parts of the population. Also, that connects to distributional characteristics of the population, and then populations can affect conflict dynamics. Where people are can affect where conflict is fought and where it's not, in the sense of back in the pre-modern era, wars were fought in fields and areas near populated areas, but there was a separation between war fighting and where civilians are. Now, with the causes and characteristics of modern civil conflict, the use of terrorism, asymmetric warfare, IED attacks, and those kind of things, the blending between where population lived and where conflict happens has been blurred. And we see this in the Russia and Ukrainian conflict, in which you have, and with the Gaza example, which we're going to look at in a second, you have areas where civilians are affected, if not outright targeted, in order to try to fight conflict. There could be unintended or intended consequences. And this kind of made me think about the inverted U of democratic institutions and conflict that is opposite to this U here, in which you have anocracies at the highest risk of conflict and established democracies and autocracies on the other side being at less risk of conflict, because in autocracies you have solidified control and the negative costs of conflict are likely to be high, and in democracies there's a provision of social services and a way to try to get policy change without resorting to violence. And I think when you think about population, resource scarcity, and conflict, in connecting to those expectations in the previous slide, you have in areas of relative abundance and scarcity, there should be that higher expectation of conflict. And you can see that a lot of these characteristics wouldn't necessarily be unique to the 21st century. I think the other characteristics of conflict are probably at least as important or more temporally connected to where we are now than these kind of population pressures, which should be able to apply to the Mayan example, in which you had this civilization in Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, in Honduras and Guatemala, basically almost extinguish or have to migrate away because of population-induced resource scarcity. Nowadays, as with the Sen quote, you should be able to have adequate redistribution. But I think it's interesting to kind of bring in those historical comparisons and context. This is a separate book that I have the citation for the Goldstone book in the course guide. I think he really does some really interesting research, kind of like with the Max Rosser graph earlier, in which you look at wider swaths of history and historical trends to try to understand to what extent we are living in similar or different times than the ones we often look at just in the post-World War II era, and that he, in this book, Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World, suggests that state breakdowns in Europe, China, and the Middle East all came from a similar process connected to population growth, which led to changing prices for goods, connecting to right now the inflation that we've seen in a whole host of goods, shifting resources, increased social demands on relatively inflexible economic and political structures. I was having lunch with my grad student the other day, and he remarked that because of the increasing cost of goods, where he got his bowl at a restaurant in Cambry, the bowl had gotten smaller, and the food, therefore, within it also got smaller. So, connecting it to other population prices in a whole bunch of in other contexts from 1500 to 1850, looking at English population growth in the solid line and wheat prices, that basically as more people are in a society, their demand for resources matches the supply, and that kind of draws up or is correlated to increasing prices for basic goods. He makes that connection related to the English Revolution, the French Revolution as well. Again, the end of the 18th century, that time in which Malthus was writing, you see the dramatic increase in wheat prices in the second half of the 18th century in France, as well as population growth, which could be a driving factor for people's dissatisfaction with the monarchy and the storming of the Bastille. Connected to the Chinese population and prices, in which you had rice and population prices pretty dramatically correlated as well. And he makes this whole demographic argument. I said in the beginning that I might be stepping on demographers' toes, but I think there's an important role for politics to play in all of this. Another path diagram, that you have this state fiscal distress there as one of those important driving factors for all of this, which connects to the classist theme of the importance of politics and redistribution as a driver for conflict, as well as elite competition as well. And a couple of interesting quotes from this book at the start of each of these chapters. I think they reiterate the importance of these roles of the cost of living and population pressures leading to potential individual level motivations for conflict. And this one quote saying, "The specialists persist in ignoring the aggravating role that demographic pressure might have played in the crisis of the ancient regime." And in the Ottoman and the Ming Qing transition, talking about how this the resources of heaven and earth have been exhausted, which connects to the Malthusian argument, right? That in the Ottoman Empire, in these empires in what is now China, in England and in France, the similar population pressures leading to conflict. So I think for me, what is interesting, and I'll end this long initial segment, which would be the longest for today, the one thing that I haven't talked about yet is the reason why Malthus and NeoMathusians haven't been proven correct yet is because the greatest growth in technological capabilities to grow food for a growing population that we've seen in the last 150 years has outpaced our demand for food, and that industrial agriculture, like in the Central Valley in California, has been able to provide for a dramatically increasing population, and the resources of heaven and earth might come under stress, like in the Gaza case, which we're going to look at in a second. But is there something, and in tying to the Gleditsch reading for this week, have there been technological solutions or ways of dealing with these challenges that mean that the world that we see today and the potential challenges we'll see in the future are systematically different than the cases that people have looked to in the past to try to look at the importance of population growth and environmental scarcity? Do you think that the modern world is systematically different than Goldstone's case studies, and that the demographic pressures that we've talked about in this video are less relevant than other factors that we're going to see? Or does it or does it connect to other factors that might have an interactive effect? I'd be interested in your take. Please, for those students in the class, leave your comments on Waddle. If you're not taking the class and stumbled across this video and made it this far, congratulations. I'd be interested to hear your take in the comments below. And so with that, I'll end this initial discussion of population pressures and the potential links to conflict, and we'll turn now to a background video on the Rwandan genocide and the potential for environmental factors potentially explaining the intensity of the violence back in 1994.